Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into something both complex and, well, a little pungent. The medieval, and this was the meeting place for weary travelers and questionable stew. Where ale poured freely in, so did the lice. Half your night here would be spent wondering if that noise upstairs was someone snoring or actually dying. Before you settle in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I am doing here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who joins us from all over the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for some ambient background noise. And let's ease into tonight's story together. The thing about the innkeeper is, he doesn't so much wake up as he is woken up by the gentle sound of someone sneezing directly onto the floorboards below, followed by a groan, a crash, and the unmistakable chaos of a chicken escaping through the front door. He cracks one eye open. Oh, it's still dark. Which means it's either too early or too late. There is no in-between when it comes to medieval timekeeping. He sits up slowly, as though peeling himself off a loaf of bread, rubbing sleep from his face with a sleeve that used to be linen, but now feels more like a worn saddlebag. The bed isn't bad, just simple. A straw mattress, slightly slanted, with a blanket that faintly smells of garlic and last Tuesday's ale cozy. In the way a slightly damp cloak is cozy, if you don't ask too many questions. He gets dressed in stages, first the tunic, then the trousers, then the belt, if he can find it. After a brief search, he locates it hanging on a peg behind the door, along with a spoon, a stub of a candle, and someone's sock. Downstairs, the common room is quiet in a way that's almost unsettling. There are signs of life: a tipped mug, a boot by the hearth, and a man snoring under a table with a confidence that suggests he's done this before. The innkeeper steps carefully around him. Waking guests too early often leads to awkward conversations at sword point. He stokes the hearth with a practiced flick. The goal is warmth, not a roaring fire. Firewood is expensive, and the last time he made a real blaze, someone tried to cook a goose on it. As he sets a pot over the flames to reheat whatever last night's stew has turned into, hears the distant braying of a mule and the clomping of early travelers arriving. He sighs. The inn isn't glamorous, but it's warm, it's busy, and most importantly, it's his. And just like that, the day begins again. Breakfast at the inn is less a meal and more a negotiation between what is edible and what is legally defensible. The innkeeper ladles a thick scoop of something into a pot over the fire. It doesn't really have a name, but it does have a smell somewhere between boiled oats and a wet boot with aspirations of cabbage. This is pottage, the medieval staple, not so much a recipe as a concept. Yesterday's pottage was barley and turnips. Today's has those same turnips, and some mysterious bits from the goose that didn't escape last night. Add water, heat, repeat. It's like soup, if soup had given up halfway through. The bread is present hard as a roof tile, and just as chewable as ever. The bread is cut carefully, mainly because the innkeeper doesn't want to risk breaking yet another knife on it. Guests chew it slowly, partly for the sake of digestion, and partly because it gives them time to reconsider their life choices between bites. And the alias breakfast beer. It's not some medieval, it's a necessity. The water here is questionable at best. The milk is reserved for the Lord's barn cat. And tea is nothing more than a distant dream in the mind of a faraway merchant. The ale is weak, but at least it's been boiled and strained through sheer desperation. Even the children drink it, though always under supervision. This is, after all, a respectable establishment. By now, guests begin trickling in one by one. A merchant clutching his coin purse like a sacred relic, a drowsy pilgrim gripping his walking stick and muttering about blisters, and inevitably, the bard who requests honey for his porridge, as if honey hasn't been locked away for weeks. The barmaid, nimble and utterly unfazed, moves between the tables like a dancer who's had enough. She smiles at the patrons, tops off their mugs, and dodges unwanted compliments with the ease of someone who's memorized every bad poem a drunken traveler can recite. By the end of breakfast, the inn smells like smoke, barley, and ambition. Empty bowls clatter onto tables, stomachs are satisfied, and spirits are lukewarm. It's not fine dining, but it's hot, filling, and so far, no one's died-witched by medieval standards. Is a resounding success. If there's one thing a medieval inn doesn't need more of, it's people. Yet by mid-morning, they begin to pour in like pigeons with luggage and about the same regard for personal hygiene. First through the door is a night-or at least, someone claiming to be one. He does have armor, but it's mismatched, rusty, and held together with what looks suspiciously like curtain rope. He demands a private room, despite having no money, no manners, and the general aroma of a horse that lost a bet. Behind him comes a merchant's apprentice, who talks as if he owns a fleet of ships, but pays with buttons. He tries to haggle over the price of soup, as if this was the kind of place that offered special deals. Then comes the bard and has one. He never actually pays, but insists his songs are worth more than gold. He carries a lute 6 strings, missing, and immediately launches into a mournful tune about lost love and goat theft. Nobody asked for this. Next, a monk shuffles in, solemnly nodding to everyone and blessing the furniture, insists on fasting loudly while eyeing the bread, and within 10 minutes he's eating it, explaining that it's not technically a sin if the loaf was already broken. By noon, the inn is full of clashing personalities and overlapping smells. Someone is drying socks by the hearth, someone else is sharpening a knife for no apparent reason, and a child is darting between tables chased by a goose with a vendetta. In the corner, 2 travelers argue over who gets the only stool that doesn't wobble. And presiding over it all is the innkeeper, as calm as a monk on payday. He's seen it all before. He knows that by evening, someone will fall in love, someone will nod off in their soup, and someone, probably the bard, will challenge a stool to a duel. He pours another mug, wipes the counter with a cloth that's seen ... the barmaid, and gives her a not a silent agreement that, for all its chaos, the inn is still standing. The guests may be unpredictable, noisy, and sometimes even bleeding. But they also what gives this place its life, and the innkeeper wouldn't he have it any other way, maybe a bit quieter, and with fewer goose chases. If the inn has a salor, at least a functioning brain, it's the barmaid. Her name is Marjorie. She's about 20, or maybe 30, or maybe she just aged fast from years of dealing with traveling poets. Nobody's quite sure. What everyone does know is that the whole place would collapse into a soggy heap without her. Marjorie moves through the mayhem with practiced precision, one hand balancing a tray of mugs, the other swatting away a wandering hand that's misjudged her patience. Her reflexes are sharper than a ferret loose in a pantry. Once a drunken mercenary tried to compliment her ankles. He woke up 2 days later with his boots nailed to the ceiling. Marjorie can take an order in for dialects, pour ale without spilling a drop, and insult a noble without technically committing treason. She's not rude, just efficient. In a building held together by splinters and half-promises, she's the only one with real authority. She knows who will pay in coins and who will attempt to barter with seashells. She can spot a fake accent, a stolen ring, or a flirt disguised as a complaint about the food. The monk might mutter about sin, but even he knows Marjorie is the patron saint of keeping things running. Her day starts before dawn and finishes long after the fire's burned low. In that time she serves stew, chase children, bandage scraped knees, somehow refill every mug in the room often while dodging falling cutlery or breaking up an argument about who owns the goat that wandered in at lunch. And yet, she never drops the tray. That's her magic.
Oh, Marjorie might not run the inn on paper, but in practice it's her kingdom.
The innkeeper may own the walls, but she rules the floor. A wink here, sharp word there, and a glare that could curdle milk. It's a delicate dance, and she performs it daily, fueled by years of low expectations and high tolerance. Lunch at a medieval inn isn't so much a meal as it is a test of coordination, patience, and how much noise you can tolerate before your ears give up. It always starts innocently enough. The hearth is warm, the stew is simmering, and Marjorie rings the battered iron triangle that means food is ready. There's a brief, peaceful moment, then chaos erupts. Guests appear from corners you didn't know existed. A trader vaults over a sleeping dog. The bard swings his lute like he's off to war. 2 farmers bicker over who sat first, despite there being 6 empty benches and nobody keeping score. The innkeeper dishes out steaming bowls of pottage meal whose ingredients are known only to the pot and possibly some higher power. It's hearty, warm, and almost entirely without flavor, unless you count turnip as a flavor. One guest asks if it's vegetarian, Another asks what vegetarian means, and the innkeeper pretends not to hear either one. Bread is handed out with a ceremonial thunk of a loaf of bread that had recently doubled as a doorstop. Diners attempt to soften it by dipping it in their stew, resulting in several chunks sinking to the bottom of their bowls, casualties of the lunch hour. One man even manages to trade his crust for another round of ale, and it works. Marjorie weaves through the commotion, her tray loaded with mugs, her gaze locked in that 1,000-yard stare known only to battlefield nurses and women, who have already settled to arguments over seating before noon. She hands out food, smiles, and issues warnings all at once. A woman show that deserves a standing ovation, though she'll settle for a full tip jar. Somewhere by the hearth, 2 guards are engaged in a burping contest, while a suspiciously cheerful monk hums a hymn between spoonfuls. The goat has returned, Gain apparently fond of the company. Lunch lasts about an hour at least. According to the sun inside, the inn time is measured by how long it takes for someone to spill ale. Accuse another of cheating at dice or attempt to sing with a mouthful of onion? When it ends, there's a brief, eerie silence until someone drops a spoon and the noise resumes. Lunch is finished. The stew has been eaten, the bread gnawed, and the goat once again escorted out with stern words and a broom. Now comes the part of the day innkeepers dread most, cleaning up after guests who claim to be very tidy. The untrained eye, the dining room looks only mildly messy, but to Marjorie and the innkeeper, it's more like an archaeological dig-a-site full of mysterious stains, lost items, and an unsettling number of onion peels in places onions should never be. The wooden tables are wiped down with a cloth that, like the innkeeper, has seen far too much. It doesn't so much clean as smear everything into a pleasant medieval glaze. The floor is swept mostly by pushing debris under the benches and hoping gravity does the rest. A lone boot is found under a stool. No one claims it, so it's added to the growing pile behind the bar, labeled possibly belongs to someone. Marjorie collects dishes with the speed and efficiency of someone who's done this for a decade and would very much like to stop. I guess to linger too long, get the look of glare so powerful it once made a noble apologize, and tip an entire silver coin, who's never seen again, but the story lives on. The stew pot is scraped clean. Whatever's left is either fed to the pigs or quietly added to tomorrow's. Recipe waste not, want not, especially since no one can tell the difference after the third bowl. The innkeeper mutters something about washing the mugs, but everyone knows he'll just rinse them in the rain barrel and call it divine purification. There's a bucket for soaking, but at this point, it's mostly ceremonial. With the last crumbs swept away and the benches shoved back into place, always wobblier than before, the room slowly starts to look like an inn again. Rather than the aftermath of a particularly enthusiastic feast, Marjorie takes a breath, straightens her apron, and prepares for the next round. Because in a medieval inn, peace is never permanent. It's just a brief pause between one mess and the next. Somewhere, someone is already asking when supper will be ready. Just as the last bowl is stacked and the final spoon is dried, and Marjorie dares to take a quiet sip of leftover ale, it happens, the door creaks open. New guests arrive. New faces, new problems, and, worst of all, new questions. The first traveler steps in, wearing a cloak several sizes too large, a beard that could shelter a family of woodland creatures, and an expression that suggests he's already composing his review on parchment. He heads to the bar and asks, "Do you serve almond milk?" The silence is immediate and absolute. Somewhere in the corner, a stool groans under the weight of collective judgment. Behind him comes a young couple clearly not married. Given how close they stand while trying very hard not to touch his sin if they can see the room first, Marjorie just points upstairs. It's wooden, it has walls, and it usually doesn't leak in summer. A third guest, covered in dust and self-importance, insists on knowing where the inn sources its candles, whether the stew is ethically prepared, and whether the goat has been trained to stay outside. Of course, the goat chooses this moment to walk in and promptly sneezes on his boots. Then there's the bard, a different bard this time, who wants to pay with a song. He strums his lute, hits 3 wrong notes in quick succession, and launches into a ballad about the lady in the leaky chamber pot. He is immediately, if politely, asked to stop with a broom. The innkeeper nods along to every request, every complaint, and every attempt to order wine by variety. He doesn't argue, doesn't correct. He just listens, smiles, and lets Marjorie handle it. So if there's one thing that fills an inn faster than rain, it's travelers with opinions, and they never arrive quietly. By sundown, the common room is a patchwork of personalities. A quiet scribe in the corner, arguing merchants by the fire, the bard on his second attempt at winning affection by sheer volume, and the goat now asleep under table 3. The innkeeper exhales. Another batch of guests, another round of small disasters waiting to happen, and every one of them somehow thinks they re the most normal person here. Supper time doesn't arrive with elegance, but with noise, loud overlapping noise. Chairs scrape, mugs clink. Someone coughs theatrically to suggest they've been waiting ages. Even though they only arrived 9 minutes ago, and are still wearing their traveling cloak like a crown. Marjorie emerges from the kitchen holding a pot that's technically still warm and definitely still stew. The menu hasn't tea changed. The inn's signature dish. Whatever was left from earlier, slightly reheated. It comes with a chunk of bread that could double as a blunt weapon and a side of guest commentary. This stew tastes different than last night, one traveler says suspiciously. It's the same stew, Marjorie replies, not even looking up. Oh, well, it's nice, the traveler adds quickly, now worried about their cutlery privileges. The bard still here somehow offers to perform a song in honor of the meal. He gets through one verse before Marjorie places a ladle in his bowl, with a bit more enthusiasm than strictly necessary. He gets the message. By the hearth, 2 merchants are locked in a raucous debate over grain prices, somehow managing to be even louder than the couple arguing about how many fleas they found on the bed upstairs. The goat is back under the table again, this time being quietly fed scraps by a child who solemnly insists it's his emotional support livestock. The stew is hearty, the ale flows freely, and despite some grumbling about texture, temperature, or the existential mystery of the meat everyone eats, the innkeeper stands behind the counter, polishing a mug that hasn't been truly cleaned since last harvest. Watching his guests with the look of a man resigned to his destiny, he knows that in about an hour, someone will spill something, someone else will fall asleep, mid-sentence, and the bard will attempt another performance he always does. But for now, the room is noisy, chaotic, and very much alive, which, if nothing else, counts as success. In a medieval inn, supper, dose, and tea have to be good. It just needs to make it to the table without catching fire. As the last spoon scrapes the bottom of a bowl, and guests recline with the satisfied groans of people who have survived another helping of stew, the real entertainment begins. Evening amusement here is loosely defined. There's no schedule, no flyers, and no host with a lute and a timeline. The night simply unfolds the way all great shows do, spontaneously, with limited talent and a high chance of minor injury. The bard, of course, seizes the moment, clears his throat theatrically, strums 3 hesitant strings, and announces a ballad titled The Fair Lady of Festerwell, Who Married a Troll. Half the room cheers, the other half groans, and the goat sneezes. The bard sings with enthusiasm. The lyrics rhyme occasionally. The innkeeper pours himself a mug of ale and drinks deeply, knowing there are 6 verses left, and at least one will involve sock theft. At a table in the back, 2 old friends try to outdo each other in a slurred riddle contest. The rules are unclear. One riddle might actually be a recipe. Nearby monk covers his ears and starts humming psalms at a volume normally reserved for church bells. Next come the dice wooden, chipped, and possibly blessed or cursed. A crowd gathers as bets are placed. Coins, buttons, a very old pair, and one man's left shoe. Nobody questions it. The value of the pair is hotly debated. Marjorie patrols the room like a hawk with excellent hearing, watching for trouble, spills, and anyone who looks like they might stand on a table. She intercepts the bard mid-step, just as he tries to strike a dramatic pose on a bench leg, clearly not made for theater. In the corner, a shy traveler shyly produces a flute, managing 3 lovely notes before the goat headbutts him. Applause breaks out. Evening entertainment at the inn isn't polished, rehearsed, or even entirely legal in some towns. But it's real, it's loud, and it almost always ends with someone snoring into their mug or waking up with a new tattoo drawn in soot. There's no official closing time at the inn, no bell, no lights out announcement, and there's certainly no polite usher guiding guests toward the door. Closing time here is less a definitive moment and more a gradual social unraveling. It begins when the bard finally loses his audience, usually after forgetting the lyrics to the last verse and filling the gap with dramatic throat noises. Someone throws a bread crust in appreciation. It's unclear if it's applause or a bribe to make him stop. Next, a few patrons start to slump, necessarily from the ale, but from the sheer caloric heft of the stew. Gravity wins. One merchant leans back so far on his stool that he simply becomes part of the furniture, while his companion uses him as a footrest. Marjorie starts stacking empty mugs, building a small fortress of glassware. She doesn't say much, just raises an eyebrow, which in the secret language of innkeeping means wrap it up or start sweeping. There's always that one guest who insists on ordering something after the hearth is cold. Tonight, it's a peddler who believes a light snack means a whole roast duck. He gets bread, a meaningful look, and a firm suggestion to chew slowly and head to bed. The goat, ever present, has curled up by the last warm embers. Technically, animals aren't allowed inside. But by now, it's listened more attentively during story hour than half the humans, so exceptions are made. The innkeeper begins his closing rounds, poking at the dying fire, making sure no one has passed out face first in the stew pot, and gently nudging a snoring traveler off a table and onto a bench skill perfected through years of subtle repositioning. A couple heads upstairs, bumping into every surface along the way. By morning, they'll complain about the noise. The irony is noted and filed away for future passive-aggressive amusement. Eventually, the room empties not all at once, but in soft, wobbly waves like a tide of cloaks, yawns, and the occasional hiccup. The chatter fades, the laughter dies down, and the inn grows almost quiet. A mug rolls off a table. Someone upstairs drops a boot. The goat sighs deeply. But for now, the worst of the day is over. The guests are asleep, or at least horizontal, and no longer talking. Climbing the stairs in a medieval inn is an act of faith, not spiritual but structural. The steps creak, groan, and sometimes shift underfoot, as if they're considering early retirement. But for the weary traveler, upstairs means one thing: a place to collapse. The rooms vary. Some are private, if you're wealthy, or just very loud about wanting it. Most are shared dormitory style, where strangers sleep just inches apart and everyone pretends not to hear anything. The beds are simple wooden frames stuffed with straw and dreams. Blankets, if you're lucky. Pillows only if you brought your own, or are particularly skilled at folding your cloak. And yes, the straw always rustles sometimes, because it's dry. Sometimes because something else inside it is trying to sleep too. Snoring is inevitable. Someone always starts within moments of lying down. Not the gentle, endearing kind. This is medieval snoring, the sort that echoes off the beams and makes you wonder if there is a wild boar in the rafters. One guest tosses in his sleep, another talks, and someone hums a hymn through their nose, which is deeply unsettling. Privacy as a concept doesn't exist. You can pull your cloak over your head, but that only muffles the sound of the person in the next bed, loudly describing dreams about fish and taxes. Someone else keeps getting up to check on the stew, which is really just code for using the chamber pot, located discreetly behind a curtain that fools no one. Speaking of which, yes, the chamber pot. It's there, it's full, it's everyone's problem. It's even been used as a footrest, at least until someone realizes their mistake, usually too late. Every so often, someone stumbles in after dark, unsure which bed is theirs, and more than ready to argue about it. Arguments are brief, muffled by exhaustion, and typically settled by whoever has bigger boots or a stronger odor. And yet, despite the sounds, the smells, the questionable straw, and the shared air, there's something oddly comforting about it. All a dozen people from different places, sleeping under the same crooked rafters, snoring together in accidental harmony. Upstairs isn't peaceful, but it's safe, somewhat warm. And with a bit of luck, mostly free of goat switch, at this hour, is a luxury. It's late. The fire in the hearth has burned down to glowing embers. The common room is finally still, except for the occasional creak, the kind that makes you wonder if the building is settling, or if something alive is scurrying through the beams.
Either way,
It's time for the innkeeper's midnight patrol. This ritual isn't written anywhere, but every innkeeper knows it by heart. It involves a candlestick, an exhausted sigh, and a silent prayer that nobody has died, started a fire, or sleepwalked into the pantry again. The tour starts downstairs, benches mostly empty. Mugs half drunk, half spilled, and possibly fermenting into something new. A spoon floats in the ale barrel. The innkeeper doesn't want to know how or why. He checks the doors front and back, both bolted, probably maybe. The front door has a habit of swinging open during high winds or emotional conversations, so he props a bucket in front of it just in case. Behind the counter, he counts the day's takings. Most of it is real currency. Some is buttons, carved bone, and once again, that same old pair. He drops it into the undecided value bowl. Next up, upstairs. He tiptoes like a man sneaking through a nest of mildly drunk wolves, each floorboard betraying him with a creak louder than the last. Behind one door, someone snores with conviction. Behind another, someone mutters about taxes in their sleep. He peeks into the shared room, a sea of limbs and cloaks. One guest is sleeping upside down, another has tucked themselves under the bed like a human storage box. The chamber pot is, as always, full. Then comes the weird part of the patrol things that shouldn't be moving. A broom has fallen over again. The candle flickers, though there's no draft. And somewhere, the unmistakable sound of a lute string is plucked. Even though the bard supposedly went to bed 2 hours ago, and of course, the goat is missing again. The innkeeper exhales. By this inn's standards, everything is fine. He descends the stairs, blows out the candle, and mutters, "If anything catches fire, let it be the bad stew. It's the middle of the night, and technically everyone is asleep. Let us not pretend it is restful." The shared upstairs room hums like a beehive of human discomfort. Snoring is the dominant sound, layered, textured, and anything but musical. One guest snores in short bursts, like a hiccuping squirrel. Another competes for sheer volume, rattling the rafters with every exhale. It's less a lullaby and more a symphony of sleep apnea. Someone talks in their sleep, mostly about carrots. Another keeps whispering, "No, my lord," in a tone that suggests either a nightmare or an awkward romantic misadventure. A boot hits the floor with a thud.
Oh.
Nobody moves, not even the goat. Now curled up under someone's cloak, like he owns the place.
Oh.
The bed frames creak in protest every time someone rolls over, which is often since straw mattresses aren't known for comfort. In fact, if you're not poked by a twig in the first 5 minutes, the bed is probably haunted. Then there's the heat. So many bodies in one room. The temperature climbs to barn in midsummer. Cloaks are tossed aside, blankets kicked to the floor, and eventually someone opens the window, letting in a cool breeze and the local owl, who now refuses to leave. The smell is, to put it politely, robust. A heady blend of stew digestion, unwashed socks, warm goat, and the faint, ghostly trace of last night's ale. It would be unbearable if everyone weren't already too exhausted to care. Occasionally, someone wakes up convinced it's morning. It isn't. It's just somehow darker than before, and now there's an owl watching from the windowsill. They stumble out of bed, step on someone's hand, and are shushed back into place with a half-asleep grunt. Marjorie sleeps in the back room, trained to wake at the slightest hint of trouble-raised voices, at sudden crashes, or any lute music after hours. So far, so good mostly. Downstairs, the innkeeper dozes behind the bar in a chair now shaped exactly like his spine. He's still holding a mug he never finished. He dreams of silence, a dream that will not come true, because, in a medieval inn, sleep comes in short stretches, shared spaces, and questionable warmth. But as long as everyone is horizontal, that's considered a win. At the first hint of dawn, that murky, uncertain gray that could be sunrise, or just an overly ambitious moonda, and begins to stir. Not gracefully, but more like a barn full of livestock discovering the door's been left open. Feet hit the floor with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Someone groans dramatically as if waking up was an unexpected and unreasonable demand. Another guest immediately starts searching for their missing boot hits on the hearth. No one knows how it got there. The goat does, but he's not talking. The shared room empties in waves. Early risers, merchants, monks, and anyone carrying a guilty conscience slip out first. They leave behind a mess of tangled blankets, muddy footprints, and one guest still asleep, insisting even in dreams that he didn't touch the cheese. Downstairs, the innkeeper is already awake technically. His eyes are open, his body is upright, but his spirit is still somewhere between this world and wherever old innkeepers go in their dreams, a place with clean mugs and silent patrons. Marjorie arrives moments later, wrapped in a shawl and sheer determination. She begins her silent morning inventory of overnight damage. 2 overturned stools, 1 missing candle, and inexplicably, someone has smeared jam on the broom handle. The questions start immediately. Has anyone seen my satchel? Did I pay last night? Is this my goat? To each question, Marjorie gives the same response. A slow blink followed by a flat, maybe. Then come the denials. I didn't spill that ale. I wasn't the one snoring. I never said that about the monk's sandals. Everyone denies everything, loudly, even when confronted with direct evidence, like a ladle hanging from someone's belt or a half-eaten turnip inside their boot. The bard reappears, eyes blurry, declaring he's written a new verse about last night's events. He's promptly handed a bowl of porridge and told to eat quietly for once, which, miraculously, he does. Breakfast is served, stew is reheated, ale is poured, and life goes on. By the time the sun is up, most guests have either paid or bartered their way out. Some leave sheepishly, others march out proudly, convinced they were charming. But one truth remains. Nobody ever admits what happened after supper. The guests trickle out. The goat is escorted outside yet again. And Marjorie is left scraping something unidentifiable off a bench, with the focus of a surgeon and the face of someone rethinking every decision that led her here. The common room is quiet, now not peaceful, just catching its breath. A few embers crackle in the hearth. The floor is sticky. One bench leans to the left, either from misuse or protest. The innkeeper stands behind the counter, cradling his first mug of ale like a family heirloom. He surveys the room and mutters what he mutters every morning. Well, that wasn't too bad. Marjorie walks by with a tray of used spoons, frayed cloth, and the unmistakable look of someone who will not be answering questions before sunrise tomorrow. She refills the stew pot with water, salt, and faith, and begins stirring. Breakfast will happen, as always. Outside, a cart rattles by, a rooster makes its presence known, and somewhere in the village, a blacksmith hammers something unreasonably loud for this hour. And just like that, the world is awake again. And with the world come new guests. The inn's door opens. A farmer steps in, dragging a sack of something vaguely vegetable. A woman in a travel cloak enters, wearing the polite smile of someone about to complain about prices. And naturally, there's a knight with a dented helmet, and no concept of an indoor voice. They look around, nods are exchanged, coins change hands, questions are asked, and the answers are vague. The cycle begins again.
Oh.
The innkeeper takes a sip. Marjorie reties her apron. A chair is righted, a mug is filled, and a stranger immediately asks if there's a vegan option. The inn doesn't change much. Stew remains mysterious, the guests unpredictable, and the goat one suspects has a spare key. Yet despite the noise, the mess, and the truly questionable smells, people always come back. Maybe it's the warmth, the company, the chaos, or maybe, just maybe, it's the only place in town where your mistakes are swept up with the crumbs and nobody asks questions before breakfast. The final blow wasn't one single disaster, but a change in the wind. The Enlightenment was beginning, just not in the Netherlands. Britain took the title of the world's financial and naval superpower. France stole the spotlight in art and science. The Dutch, once the marvel of Europe, found themselves quietly pushed out of the center of the story. Still, the legacy of the Dutch Golden Age didn't vanish. It lived on in libraries, galleries, legal codes, and shipping routes. The world they helped shape never forgot them. They just stopped playing the main character. In our final chapter, we explore the lasting impact of this era and how a tiny republic managed to change the course of the modern world. Though the curtain fell on the Dutch Golden Age, its echoes never really stopped. The 17th century republic may have lost its global dominance, but it left fingerprints everywhere, from economics to art to our very idea of freedom. Let's start with capitalism. The Dutch didn't invent money, trade, or ambition, but they perfected them with stunning efficiency. They created the world's first stock exchange, pioneered shareholder capitalism, and invented financial tools that we still use today. If you've ever groaned over your mutual fund or stared blankly at a line graph, you have Dutch merchants to thank. They also revolutionized global commerce not just with ships, but with systems. Insurance, record-keeping, double-entry bookkeeping, all refined to near perfection in Amsterdam. And while they, They certainly weren't saints, colonialism, but they were logistical masterminds. The Dutch made trade scalable, predictable, and truly global. In the arts, their influence is everlasting. Vermeer's gentle light, Rembrandt's stormy faces, the intimate realism of daily scenes. These works became the visual language of Western art, teaching us that greatness didn't always require gods or swords sometimes. It was found in the stillness of a woman pouring milk. In ideas, the Dutch carved out space for reason. Their brand of tolerance, imperfect, but remarkable for the era gave thinkers like Spinoza and Descartes the freedom to publish works that would have been burned anywhere else. By doing so, they nudged Europe closer to the Enlightenment. Freedom of thought. Religious diversity and scientific curiosity all took root in Dutch soil. Even their cities set new standards. Amsterdam's canals, Utrecht's universities, those brick gables and clean, navigable streets all became blueprints for modern urban life. Order without excess, function dressed in elegance. The Dutch didn't build for kings, they built for citizens. And maybe that's the real heart of it. The Dutch Golden Age wasn't about empires, cathedrals, or royal decree. It was about what a small, stubborn, waterlogged republic could accomplish with brains, grit, and a borderline obsessive love of bookkeeping. It didn't last forever. Golden ages never do, but for a brief, shining century. The Dutch showed the world a new kind of success, one powered not by royalty but by ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Thanks to them, the modern world still sails in their wake, charting new waters on maps they first drew. Forget stadiums, sponsorships, and national anthems. The very first Olympic Games had none of that. No referees in polos, no timers, no slow-motion replays. Just dust, sweat, and a sacred olive tree. The year was 776 BCE. The location was Olympia, quiet religious sanctuary in the Peloponnese, dedicated to Zeus himself, king of the gods, champion of lightning bolts, an apparent fan of athletic thighs. But these weren't just local contests to pass the time between harvests, they were sacred. The ancient Greeks didn't separate worship from physical excellence. In their eyes, competing naked under the Greek sun wasn't just showing off, it was an act of divine devotion. Testing your body's limits before Zeus was the ultimate offering. Far more meaningful than sacrificing goats or writing hymns in hexameter. The origins of the games are a mythological tangle. Some say Hercules founded them after cleaning out the Augean stables, which honestly sounds like the kind of chore you'd want to turn into a sporting event. Others credit King Pelops CS, the one with the famously cursed descendants who supposedly started the games after winning a chariot race. But whatever the tale, by 776 BCE, the games were official, recorded, and already prestigious. The first recorded event. The Stadiana short foot race, roughly 600 feet long. The only known victor that year was a cook named Corybos of Elis. That's right, the first. Olympic champion was a man who probably trained by running between kitchens and slicing goat meat. He didn't get a trophy, just an olive wreath and eternal glory. Glory and the right to have epic poems written about your thighs. All competitors were Greek, male, and citizens. Women weren't allowed to compete or even watch, unless they were priestesses. Married women caught sneaking in, risked being thrown off a cliff, which feels a bit extreme, even by ancient standards. But for all the simplicity, the stakes were enormous. Winning at Olympia wasn't just a personal triumph, it brought glory to your polis, your city-state. You weren't just a man anymore, you were a hero. In an ancient Greece, heroes lived forever. The first Olympic Games may have started with a single foot race, but things escalated quickly. What began as one guy sprinting 600 feet became a sprawling schedule of events that tested every aspect of the male body. Speed, strength, balance, and how well you could wrestle someone half covered in olive oil. Let's start with the basics running. After the stadion, more races were added. The Diolos was essentially the ancient 400-meter dash, down the track and back. Then came the Dolichos, a long-distance race that could last up to 24 laps over 5 kilometers in the Greek summer heat, stark naked, with no water breaks, and definitely no music playlists. Just you, your feet, and a lot of very uncomfortable dust. But it wasn't all about speed. The Greeks loved combat sports, and their games reflected that. Wrestling or pale was a technical contestno, biting or eye gouging, but just about everything else was allowed. To win, you had to throw your opponent to the ground 3 times. It was the cerebral cousin to the far more chaotic pancration, a mix of boxing and wrestling where almost anything went: punches, kicks, chokes. It was violent, raw, and wildly popular. The main rule? Try not to kill your opponent, at least not in front of the judges. Boxing, called pygmachia, was brutal. No gloves, just leather straps wrapped around your knuckles. Matches often ended in blood, broken bones, and the only way out was to surrender. It was less float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, and more survive with your teeth. Then there was the pentathlon, a 5-event spectacle for the ultimate all-rounder: running, wrestling, long jump, javelin, and discus. The long jump was performed with weights called halters, supposedly to add momentum, though it sounds more like a tripping hazard than an athletic advantage. And finally, chariot racing in the hippodrome: fast, dangerous, and sometimes fatal. The twist? The owner of the horses won the prize, not the driver. So an aristocrat could pay a stable boy to risk his life for glory and still take home the olive wreath. Classic. Each event pushed men to their limits, and sometimes past them, but they weren't competing for gold medals or money. They were chasing something even more valuable in ancient Greece: Clio's eternal fame. To the Greeks, the Olympic Games weren't just about flexing your glistening biceps in front of a crowd. Above all, they were an act of worship. Athletes were more than competitors, they were pilgrims. And Olympia wasn't just an arena. It was a sacred site dedicated to Zeus, king of the gods. Nestled in a lush grove called the Altus, Olympia was more temple than stadium. Before a single race was run or a discus was thrown, the sacred atmosphere itself had to be honored. The most important structure at Olympia was the Temple of Zeus, a colossal Doric masterpiece that once housed a gigantic ivory and gold statue of the god, sculpted by Phidias. This statue was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And yes, it absolutely towered over the games like a divine referee. The rituals began days before the competition. Athletes took oaths before a statue of Zeus Horcus Zeus, of the oath swearing not to cheat, bribe, or bite during wrestling matches. Breaking that vow wasn't just bad sportsmanship. It was sacrilege. Cheaters were fined, and their penalties paid for bronze statues of Zeus that lined the path to the arena, eternal reminders of their shame. And then there were the sacrifices, lots of them. Dozens of bulls were slaughtered at the altar of Zeus. The smoke, the chanting, the blood was all part of a massive communal offering. The meat was cooked and shared among spectators and priests, turning the games into a sacred barbecue on a divine scale. Fire was central to the ceremony too. A sacred flame, believed to have been lit by the rays of the sun, burned at the altar of Hestia. This tradition inspired the modern Olympic flame, though thankfully we've skipped the animal sacrifice. Spectators, athletes, judges, everyone came not just for sport, but for religious renewal, for a chance to witness divine favor revealed through human excellence. The air was thick with incense and anticipation. Winning meant Zeus himself had smiled on you. Losing meant, well, maybe you should have prayed harder. At night, with the contests finished and the altars still warm, Olympia glowed with music, feasting, and philosophical debate. It was worship, festival, and spectacle all at once. If you were dreaming of participating in the ancient Olympic Games, here's the reality. You needed to be Greek, male, and very, very nude. The games were sacred, prestigious, and about as exclusive as a Spartan wine club. The rules were strict, the requirements intimidating, and the list of those allowed to compete very short.
Athletes.
First and foremost, athletes had to be freeborn Greek men, not slaves, not foreigners, not even women.
Ow.
The Olympics were a showcase of Greek masculinity in all its oiled-up glory. Competitors came from city-states across the Greek world-a-thons: Sparta, Corinth, Rhodes, and beyond, but only if they could prove their Hellenic bloodline. Citizenship was more than paperwork. It was a birthright, and without it, you weren't setting foot on that track. And then there was the nudity. Competing nude was the norm. Why? The Greeks believed the human body, especially the male body, was the physical embodiment of divine perfection. Plus, it made cheating harder. No hidden weapons, no armor, no hiding behind fancy gear. Just you, your muscles, and maybe a very unfortunate sunburn. Training wasn't optional either. Athletes had to prove they'd been preparing for 10 months beforehand and undergo a final month of supervised training at Olympia itself. This wasn't a casual hobby. It was a brutal regimen of running, wrestling, and tossing heavy objects until you resembled a marble statue minus the pedestal. As for women, they were banned from competing, and in most cases, even watching. A married woman caught attending could be thrown off Mount Typeum. Exceptions were made only for unmarried women, especially priestesses like the priestess of Demeter, who had front row seats as part of her sacred duties. But don't worry, women weren't totally excluded from athletic glory. They had their own games, the Heraean Games held in honor of the goddess Hera, featuring foot races for girls and young women fully clothed, of course. There were also age categories for the men's games, boys, youths, and adults. Still, you had to be prepared to take a hit from someone twice your size because there were no weight classes. If you ended up wrestling a guy built like a temple column, tough luck Sues decided the outcome. In the end, the games reflected Greek society just as much as they showcased athletic talent. Proud, patriarchal, and meticulously regulated. To a casual observer, the ancient Olympic Games might seem like a wholesome celebration of athleticism and religious devotion, but beneath the laurel wreaths and wrestling matches, there was something much more strategic. Politics. In ancient Greece, everything was politically even who could throw a discus the farthest. The games were the ideal opportunity for the often fractured Greek city-states, Peleus, to meet, compete, and engage in the ancient version of international PR. Athens could build temples. Sparta could train warriors, but Olympia was where you showcased your national identity. Winning an event didn't just glorify the athlete, glorified the city-state he came from. One man's victory was a billboard for his hometown's superiority. In fact, city-states often funded and trained athletes as a matter of civic pride and prestige. These weren't amateurs jogging in from the olive grove, they were finely tuned instruments of public propaganda. Victories were immortalized in poems, statues, and elaborate public celebrations. Entire cities might award Olympic victors with free meals for life, because nothing says you embody our greatness like unlimited wine and lamb chops. But the Olympics weren't just about showing off muscles. They were about showing off alliances. Political leaders used the games as a diplomatic platform. Treaties were discussed, marriages arranged, and even military campaigns were scheduled around the sacred truce that accompanied the Olympics. Ah yes, the Olympic truce, or ekacheria. This was a formal agreement that all Greek states would stop fighting during the games, so athletes and spectators could travel safely to Olympia. In theory, it was a moment of pan-Hellenic peace. In reality, it was often more of a polite suggestions. Some wars did pause, others simply ignored the memo. Sparta, naturally, was banned from the games at least once for being too eager for battle. Monuments and dedications at Olympia were also politically charged. Cities that won battles or gained new wealth built treasuries or statues to flaunt their success. The sanctuary became a kind of ancient leaderboard, a literal arms race in marble. Even cheating had political consequences. If an athlete was caught bribing an opponent or lying about his citizenship, his city's reputation suffered. And in the high-stakes world of Greek rivalry, that was nearly as bad as losing a war. Becoming an Olympic athlete in ancient Greece was as simple as signing up and hoping for the best. It was a brutal, lifelong commitment, equal parts devotion, self-denial, and a surprising amount of sand where you really didn't want it. Couldn't just show up at Olympia and expect to compete. You had to prove yourself. Before even stepping onto the track, you were expected to survive months of brutal preparation. Athletes trained at the gymnasium, a classic Greek institution that was equal parts fitness center, temple, and philosophy salon. The word gymnasium literally means place to be naked, which pretty much sums up the vibe. Training was done in the nudid to shock anyone, but because the Greeks saw the human body as a vessel of divine strength and beauty. Every city had its own gymnasia, but the most serious Olympic hopefuls traveled to Elis, the city that managed the games. There, under the sharp eyes of officials and trainers, They endured a mandatory 30-day boot camp before the Olympics. No distractions. No wine, no excuses. Just relentless drills and a diet that would make modern athletes cry. Barley bread, figs, cheese, and plenty of olive oil, which was for rubbing on your skin, not eating. The trainers, known as patatribes, were no softies. They pushed athletes through wrestling drills, sprinting routines, javelin throws, and strength exercises. The Greeks had zero patience for slackers. You couldn't keep up, you were out, no questions asked. Judges even disqualified contestants before the games began, if they didn't meet the strict physical standards. Discipline was everything. There were no gym memberships, no protein shakes, and certainly no fans cheering you on from Instagram. Just sweat, sun, and the grind. The standoff began when the rebels demanded Neville surrender himself and any incriminating tax records. He refused. Shots were fired. By the next day, it had escalated into a full-blown gun battle. Government troops, tax resistors, and locals exchanged musket fire. Neville's house was eventually set on fire, and 2 people were killed. The message was unmistakable. The frontier was not bluffing. In the days that followed, resistance turned into full-scale mobilization. Around Pittsburgh, a rebel militia nearly 7,000 strong formed. Calling themselves Defenders of Liberty and echoing the rhetoric of 1776, they organized mass meetings, passed resolutions, and openly discussed independence not from Britain this time, but from the eastern United States. Federal officials fled. Tax offices shut down. Pittsburgh, terrified it would be burned to the ground, tried to distance itself from the rebellion. Word of the uprising spread fast, sparking copycat resistance in Kentucky, Virginia, and even the Carolinas. Too many Americans, especially those in government, it was starting to look like Shays' Rebellion 2.0. But this time, with more guns and better whiskey. What did the rebels actually want? That was less clear. Some demanded repeal of the tax, others called for Western independence, and a few even suggested forming a new America west of the mountains. One thing, however, was certain. This was no longer just a tax protest, it was a direct challenge to the federal government's authority under the Constitution. The rebellion raised a terrifying question. If one region could ignore a federal law with no consequences, what kind of union had they really built? By fall of 1794, the Whiskey Rebellion had grown from a local disturbance into a direct threat to the power of the Constitution itself. In the East, elites feared the collapse of federal authority. In the West, rebels talked openly like revolutionaries. And in the middle stood President George Washington, watching as his carefully stitched republic threatened to unravel at the seams. This was no ordinary land order problem. It was the first real test of federal authority under the new Constitution. Washington understood what was at stake. If the rebellion succeeded, or if it went unpunished, it would send a dangerous message the federal government could be ignored, defied, and humiliated. So Washington made a decision that stunned the young nation. He would lead the army himself. To this day, he remains the only sitting U.S. president to personally command troops in the field. For a man who had famously stepped down from power after the Revolution, this wasn't about ego, it was about necessity. He wanted to prove that the Constitution was more than just parchment. The Constitution had muscle, with Hamilton by his side, acting as his ever-enthusiastic second-in-command. Washington mobilized a massive force, nearly 13,000 troops, larger than the entire Continental Army had ever been. Militiamen from New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia assembled as if it were 1776 all over again. Only this time, they weren't marching off to fight the British, they were heading west to confront their own countrymen. Washington rode out himself, in full military uniform, grim and resolute. His presence was meant to intimidate, and it did. As the army marched westward, the rebels began to scatter. Many had assumed the government would stay in Philadelphia and argue over letters. They hadn't expected muskets, drums, and a president on horseback. By the time the Federal Army reached western Pennsylvania, the rebellion had all but evaporated. Leaders vanished, local support melted away. The sheer show of force worked, but Washington had no appetite for bloodshed. Once the region was secured, he handed command over to General Light Horse Harry Lee and returned to Philadelphia. His point was made. The government could have donned would defend its laws. When Washington's army arrived, they didn't find a battlefield, they found silence. The rebel militias had mostly disappeared into the hills, and towns that once buzzed with anti-tax rage now greeted federal troops with suspiciously polite smiles. The rebellion hadn't ended in a clash. It had ended in retreat. Still, justice had to be served, at least symbolically. Over 150 suspected rebels were arrested, many of them more bewildered than belligerent. Some had merely been caught in the wrong tavern at the wrong time. The federal government wanted to prove it meant business, but it also needed to avoid looking like a tyrant crushing poor farmers. It was a delicate balance. In the end, only 2 men were convicted of treason. Both had participated in the attack on Neville's estate at Bower Hill and were found guilty under the new U.S. laws. And then, in a twist that perfectly captured the political tightrope of the moment, Washington pardoned them both. Why? Because Washington understood what every revolutionary-turned-president must eventually learn. Sometimes unity matters more than punishment. He had made his point. The law had been upheld. The Constitution had held firm. Executing a couple of whiskey rebels might have turned them into martyrs or worse, reignited the flames of resistance. Instead, Washington chose mercy. It was calculated, yes, but also true to his leadership style. Firm in principle, restrained in action. His goal wasn't vengeance, it was precedent. The precedent was clear. The federal government had the right to tax and the power to enforce. For the first time since the Constitution was ratified, the central government faced a real challenge, passed the test. Barely. But not everyone saw it that way. For many on the frontier, the rebellion only confirmed their worst fears, that the federal government cared more about Eastern elites than Western farmers, that Hamilton's financial plans served bankers, not barrel makers, and that maybe, just maybe, the revolution had been for nothing. Still, the rebellion faded. The tax dead at least for a while, but its legacy would ripple through American politics for decades to come. The muskets were silent, and the rebels had gone home. But politically, the real battle was just beginning. The Whiskey Rebellion didn't just test federal authority, expose deep fractures in the young republic's identity. At the heart of this divide were 2 towering figures, each with a radically different vision for America: Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Hamilton, the architect of the whiskey tax, saw the rebellion as proof that a strong central government wasn't just helpful, but essential for national survival. His vision of America was industrial, urban, financially stable, and respected abroad. To Hamilton, the show of force in Pennsylvania was a victory for order and the rule of law. Jefferson, though, saw something else entirely. As Secretary of State, he was less appalled by the rebellion than by Washington and Hamilton's military response. To Jefferson and his growing base of agrarian supporters, the government looked less like a republic and more like an empire sending 13,000 troops to confront angry farmers over a liquor tax. That wasn't enforcement. It was intimidation. Jefferson feared Hamilton's vision would create a country run by bankers, merchants, and elites, the very people who had lounged in London parlors while ordinary colonists fought at Bunker Hill. Jefferson's America was rural, decentralized, and rooted in the virtues of the independent farmer. The Whiskey Rebellion became political ammunition. Jefferson and James Madison began organizing opposition to Hamilton's Federalist policies. Their movement, soon to be called the Democratic Republicans, framed themselves as the protectors of liberty, the Constitution, and the common man. The Federalists, in turn, painted Jefferson's camp as mob sympathizers. Ready to turn America into another France during the Reign of Terror, the rebellion, in other words, helped crystallize what had only been simmering before America's first political parties. Lines were drawn, newspapers took sides, and the whiskey tax debate became shorthand for a much larger struggle. Central power versus local autonomy, elite control versus populist resistance. So while the rebellion was crushed militarily, it lived on politically, became a story both sides would retell, each in their own way. The Whiskey Rebellion may have fizzled on the battlefield, but in politics, it started a fire that would smolder for generations. It wasn't just about whiskey or taxes anymore. It became a symbol one wielded very differently, depending on who was telling the story. For Federalists, the rebellion was proof that the new Constitution worked. After the chaos of the Articles of Confederation, when rebellion went unanswered, and the government could barely afford ink this time, was different. The law was challenged, and the law responded. The peaceful dispersal of the rebels, followed by orderly trials and presidential pardons, painted a picture of mature, responsible governance. Power restrained, not abused. To the Democratic Republicans, however, the whole affair reeked of hypocrisy. The revolution had been fought over taxation without representation. And now a federal government dominated by Eastern elites had marched an army across the Appalachians to crush a protest by poor farmers. To Jefferson's supporters, it felt less like unity and more like occupation. The rebellion became a symbol of a government that had forgotten its roots. This ideological tug-of-war spilled into the public arena. Newspapers published fiery editorials, political clubs argued over the meaning of liberty. Was the rebellion a dangerous echo of mob rule, or a desperate cry for fairness from the margins of the Republic? Even the word rebellion became contested. Federalists called it treasonous insurrection, while Democratic Republicans labeled it civil disobedience. In time, the events of 1794 became less about what happened and more about what they meant. Looming over all of it was the Constitution itself. The Whiskey Rebellion was the first moment the federal government tested its new legal framework against real resistance and survived. It proved that the delicate balance of federal and state power was not just theoretical; it could be enforced. But it also exposed a hard truth. Not everyone experienced the Constitution the same way. For elites in Philadelphia, it was protection. For farmers in western Pennsylvania, it was intrusion. After the smoke cleared and Washington's army went home, the frontier returned to its usual rhythm of hard labor, harsh weather, and hard liquor. The rebellion was over officially, but the echoes lingered, and so did the resentment. Though the government had made its point, enforcement of the whiskey tax remained a mess. Collectors were still afraid to show their faces in the western counties. Revenue was minimal. In some places, the tax was simply ignored. The law existed on paper, but not in practice. And that was the irony. After all the drama, the military show of force, and the high-minded speeches about national authority, the whiskey tax barely worked. Even Hamilton, the architect of the policy, began to realize it wasn't worth the cost. The tax had caused massive political backlash, helped create an opposition party, and stirred up anti-federal sentiment that would haunt the Federalists for years. All for a tax that didn't even bring in much revenue, at exactly a win. Meanwhile, the frontier wasn't just some distant, backward outpost, it was growing rapidly. More settlers pushed westward, and the idea of a centralized government taxing their livelihoods began to seem less like governance and more like a grudge. When Thomas Jefferson won the presidency in 1800, ushering in the first peaceful transfer of power between rival parties, he brought a very different philosophy to the White House. Where Hamilton had tried to build federal strength, Jefferson wanted to minimize government intrusion, especially on small farmers. And one of his first acts as president? Repealing the whiskey tax? By 1802, it was gone just like that. The controversial tax that had sparked a rebellion shaped the identity of early American politics and sent George Washington himself riding into the field, vanished with a few strokes of a pen. No riots, no flames. Just a quiet admission that sometimes power isn't worth the fight. The law had held, yes, but the people had spoken too. And for all its symbolism, the whiskey tax ultimately revealed how fragile federal authority can be when it ignores the lives of those on the margins. In this final chapter, reflect on the long-term legacy of the Whiskey Rebellion and how its echoes still shape debates about government power and protest. The muskets are long silent, the barrels are empty, the tax repealed. Yet the legacy of the Whiskey Rebellion lingers, aged like the liquor that sparked it. At first glance, it might look like a footnote in the vast history of the early Republica regional dispute, a tax gone wrong, a brief flicker of armed protest. But look closer, and you'll see a moment that encapsulates a profound American dilemma. Who holds power, and how far will people go to resist it? The rebellion forced the new nation to confront uncomfortable questions. Could the federal government enforce its laws? Yes, but would doing so fracture the very unity it was meant to protect? Also yes. It highlighted the delicate balance between law and liberty, and showed that a republic doesn't run on paper alone. It runs on perception, participation, and trust. Washington's decision to ride out with the army wasn't just a show of strength. It was a powerful symbol that the Constitution was more than ink and ideals. But Jefferson's later repeal of the tax showed the other side of that coin. Federal power must also listen, not just lead. In that tension between enforcement and empathize, the DNA of American politics, over time, the Whiskey Rebellion became a case study in governance. Scholars cite it when discussing federal authority, the limits of protest, and the birth of America's political parties. Modern debates about taxation, rural disenfranchisement, and federal overreach all echo this story with eerie familiarity. Culturally, the rebellion remains potent. It's the only time a sitting U.S. president led troops in the field. It sparked political movements, shifted national dialogue, and challenged the boundaries of dissent in a young democracy. In many ways, the rebellion wasn't about whiskey at all. It was about who gets heard when the government makes decisions that affect everyday lives. Today, the story of the Whiskey Rebellion serves as both a warning and a reminder. Even in a democracy, laws must earn their legitimacy, and power must be wielded with care. The line between governance and provocation is razor thin, and sometimes it runs straight through a glass of corn mash. History may have aged the whiskey, but the rebellion still burns.